Thank you so much for having me, John, and thank you for that beautiful introduction.
Great introduction.
I am thrilled to be here. And I guess the first thing I would like to do is just acknowledge that today is Juneteenth. And I know we'll speak a little more about the protests and the pandemic as we go along, but I do want to acknowledge that that this is an important day, and we're all being called to action, and I'm looking for the ways that I can contribute my privilege in to some useful effect. And so it is awkward to turn from that to my novel, but that's what I'm going to do. And it's Cheryl and I will speak later about what it's like to be publishing during this time, and I'll say a little more then. I thought that I'd begin by reading from the opening of the novel, not the very beginning, but a little bit, a few pages in, and I'll read very briefly. I've chosen this passage because it sort of describes what it is that I'm doing with this project, with this novel. And I'll just begin. I'm a novelist of sorts, using biographies of real people as jumping off points for the stories I tell. I have written 3 novels, all of which feature families playing central roles. Families, for me, are like countries. They both contain and create the subject, while a childhood shapes a life. Jean Beret was a subject, an impoverished orphan of an illiterate couple who grew up to circumnavigate the globe in the 18th century, dressed as a man. Jane Wilson, ethereal painter of the sky, raised in Dust Bowl, Oklahoma by a poet and an engineer, took long car trips across the country with her parents and her sisters, watching the changing landscape bookended by oceans. And Hypatia, earliest female mathematician, astronomer, philosopher, daughter of Theon, renowned mathematician, mother unknown, erased by history. I made it my job to resurrect this mother, and therefore Hypatia, through deduction. Now, after years of wanting to, I had trained my work on my grandmother, writing her story. This is what I told myself, what I told people who asked at parties what I was working on. It was good to have a clear, unimpeachable subject, one that was straightforward, but admitted just the same enough depth and complexity to keep things interesting. It put me at ease, and therefore my interrogator gave me a sense of purpose, or at least a sense that I knew what I was doing with myself. More pointedly, I said, on grant applications, for instance, that I was interested in my grandmother, born in 1904, dead in 2001, because her life spanned a century in which so much had changed for women, and she, an ordinary, unhistoric person, was cast within the flow of big history. Whenever I thought of her life against this backdrop, I felt a vista open up before me, a prairie emerging in the original sense of the word, forest suddenly giving way to the horizon and tall grass blowing in the wind. I felt that distant woman call to me, and so she became my subject, as she had always wanted to be for me. For years, I couldn't see, in the way we can never see the most important things for what they are, most likely because they present themselves in the form of endless rows of dusty basement boxes, that her story was mine, not the details or the particulars, not the facts or the fabrications, but perhaps the one big fact, that she once was and so was I. We were shaped differently by our times, by the ways in which we were raised and educated, of course. But what did my grandmother and I share? There was no way through this, I knew, but through the particulars. There were the particulars, for instance, of an epic, heroic past, some of it factual, some of it running parallel to fact, some of it orbiting in a broad elliptical path, like Pluto around the truth, and some of it like the stories about the gods we give to the constellations in the sky. We project the epic onto the sky to find in the chaos of the cosmos the patterns connecting star to star that give a snug fit to Orion's belt, to place in one's palm the ladle of the Big Dipper, and to receive a few practical orienting tricks. That the Dipper's cup points to true north. My own true north understood that there was something essential being done in my mother's basement, in sifting through and sorting out truth from fable, though even fables have something deeply true about them that outlasts us. My mother's disintegrating mind, our own unique and individual selves, shuttling off into the unknown, a truth beyond the objects we tossed into the dumpster and the objects we held onto, a truth in the stories that would remain when we were dead and gone. If Glenna were a constellation, you would see her white teacher's smock striding westward across the dew-wet grass of Montana, a rifle in one hand, Temple's notes to Shakespeare in the other. There wasn't room in the sky for a husband with a wandering eye, but that was where stories came in, to fill out an evening, to ask about duplicity and betrayal, the steady march of self-compromise that led to whatever cul-de-sac of banality one found oneself in, and then to wonder about what a genuine hero would do about such things. If my grandmother and her little sister Catherine were constellations, they would be in another part of the sky entirely. Grammy would be kneeling, facing east with her 43 Egyptian, just about ready to pick off a prairie dog. Her sister would be standing next to Grammy, looking west toward Glenna. The larger truth, the one that would outlast all of us, would be reflected in this constellation, this mise-en-scène. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Martha. Can you see me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, excellent. There are many places I want to start, but I think the novel has a feel of a memoir. And I was wondering, and your novels are these huge constellations of characters in these incredibly vivid settings. And I was wondering, is there a box with mementos that you discovered that inspired the novel?
Why, yes, there is. My computer happens to be sitting upon that box right now.
Right, and so what did you find? Did you always know what was in that box?
No, I actually didn't. I actually found it in the basement, sort of like I describe in the novel, but differently. And but I don't know if I found it there. Actually, I may have found it in my mother's closet, but I found it. And actually, after I'd been working on the book for a long, long time, it took me 8 years to write this book, and. But it had all these really important things to her that were hers. Mainly just letters, a lock of hair of my great grandmother that she clipped when she died, and letters that her husband had written, and all these things. And I was fascinated by it. It told a story in itself, in the little pieces, if you could piece together the different aspects of what I found in the box, they told a story. And I found that fascinating. What she, when somebody dies, you talk about their important papers. Yes. These were her important papers.
And but you had started the book before you found the box with all these mementos.
Yes, it took me 8 years to write this book. Like literally, I went away from it a lot. I had teenage kids, and I had other obligations that got in the way. My mother developed dementia. I became pretty much her primary caretaker. I was teaching a lot. But I didn't find this. I found this maybe less than a year before the end of writing it.
And how did it change the writing of the book?
Well, it gave me something to, like the details of what are inside the book, inside the box. I sort of knew those stories, not maybe the specifics of my grandfather's letters to his mother, or letters that he wrote to his mother when he was just married but on a business trip. There were things in there, things about me. We were very close. It became more of a metaphor for me. A literal container. There's a chapter in which I describe the black box. And if we think of what a black box is in an airplane, or on the TV was called the black box, and it sort of was the container for all these stories. So I used it as a device, really.
So the grandmother, who I think we should tell the people who haven't read the book, just to give them an outline, the story is really driven by the character of Thelma, who was known as Tommy, who becomes Catherine, and then becomes Grammy. And so we start in the beginning of her life when her mother discovers her husband in bed with someone else, takes the kids in these 3 tokens, which are the physical things that go throughout the book. One is this bowl, one is a book of Shakespeare. I can remember the third one
A Bible.
A Bible. And then takes them off to Montana, of all places, a woman alone with 2 young girls. And the story just takes you away. And the protagonist is her older daughter, who then basically takes care of the younger daughter and follows her through the course of her life. And it's an extraordinary story. And where I wanted to begin my relationship to it was, I call this interview series Between Two Worlds because I live between here and New Zealand. In New Zealand, my best friends were from Montana. And the last time I was in New Zealand, we were told where the set was for Jane Campion's new film, which is called The Power of the Dog. And they had built a ranch so it looked like 19th century Montana.
Wow. Wow.
And then when I read your book, I'm one of like the 3 people in the world who was not a fan of The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. In that book, I don't know if you've read it, takes place in Hokitika on the west coast of New Zealand, which was this tiny little gold rush town, not unlike Butte or any of these Montana towns, that had like 30 synagogues and 40 hotels because of everyone was coming for the gold rush.
Right.
But what I didn't feel about that book, it didn't really breathe life into it. I didn't really feel the characters. I feel she's a very intellectual writer. And what I felt about your book was it really brought me into that whole, traveling across the country, especially a woman alone. She does this incredible things with her kids on the train, getting caught in the worst snowstorm in Montana. And everything is so vivid and so alive. And this character who takes us through this adventure is so rich, and you just want to go everywhere with her. And I think it just filled in all those spaces about what that life was like. And I was wondering, how were you able to, did you have to embellish the stories you were told? Did you do a lot of research?
Oh, yes.
Did you go to Butte? I mean, what fragments created this narrative?
So you said that it reads like a memoir, and it's definitely not a memoir. I mean, it's drawn from stories that my grandmother told me, but I like to think of them as no more than breadcrumbs. They were these little stories I heard my entire life about Nancy Cooper Slagle carrying her baby who died across the Allegheny Mountains, escaping the Confederate South. And, I heard these stories, and they were, and my grandmother would tell them. She could just speak and speak and speak. And they were always about women. And it took me a while to appreciate that they were just, these were stories of heroic women doing incredible things with the limited resources they had. And so when I wanted to write this book, from the moment I knew I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't have the sophistication, the technical ability, the talent, the perspective on life that I needed to understand what her stories were, what they meant. And basically, the novel is sort of exploring that question. But so, yeah, I had these breadcrumbs that I could follow. I knew she went as a little girl out west, out to Montana. I knew that she liked to say her father had a wandering eye for women. And I knew those details, but I didn't know a lot else. And so I did the research. And why Montana in 1910? And it took me a nanosecond discover the Enlarged Homestead Act of 1909, and that they wanted to populate the desert, which it was described as before this period. And so I just, I started reading a lot, reading histories, reading articles in newspapers and magazines, going back to archives from that time, so that reading people's journals, just ordinary people's journals of their lives. And I learned about the landscape and the country, and that country specifically, and what the issues were, and through research. And then I put the characters into that land.
It's very much a novel about self-invention, and also about class, the opportunities of class. I mean, one of the constant themes is she came from a working class background. I don't even know if you'd call it working class. This child didn't, the main character, Grammy, Thelma, Tommy, basically doesn't go to school, lets her sister go to school, is completely and totally hardscrabble, sort of like the American mythology, but she's a woman, which I thought she can shoot and she can skin coyotes, and she could get herself out of every difficult situation. And that basically translates into a person at the end of her life who has completely reinvented herself. And it kind of reminded me, like, you ever watch Antiques Roadshow, and somebody says, this is my watch that my mother told me, was worn by Marie Antoinette. So there's that element that, when you make it in America, you somehow have to recreate your history. But another thing that I found was very interesting in the book is that there are these mythologies about ancestry that are created by her mother, by Glenna, that they're related somehow to Mary Queen of Scots, that they all have this heraldic ancestry, and somehow that legitimizes them and gives them purpose to be someone. And one of the questions you asked in the beginning of the book, what makes a life?
Right.
And like you're constantly referring to that. What makes to these lives a character? What's a good life? What's a genuine life? What makes a life?
Right.
And that's constantly being talked of, and it's re-evaluated through the course of this woman's existence.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the big question of the book, and it seems like we're all improvising, trying to figure it out. And she certainly was, and I was drawn to looking at that because when I first thought of this as a writer, somebody, not as a young woman who wanted to write the story, but as somebody who'd written 3 or 4 novels, because this was supposed to be my 4th one, but dear money got in the way. What I would say is I want to write the story of a woman's life across against the backdrop of the 20th century. So I wanted to look at the progression of a woman's life, and the things that are important to a woman, and the resources that a woman had to get, an ordinary, not one of super privilege, to get from there to here, and how did she evolve over that time. And that was based on my grandmother, but along the way she also becomes a little bit, she becomes fictionalized. And yeah.
What do you think? And because I'm with you with this, because I write from basis, like you call them, breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
Like my novel began with photographs I found in my father's closet.
Right.
And so I'm always being asked this question: why fiction? Why not memoir? And I think you have this scope that you can play with when you write fiction. I mean, when you write about historical periods, you have to really know what you're talking about. You can't. And there is all of that in your book, but there's something expansive about the imagination, about letting the imagination loose, thinking about these things that you don't really know all the history about.
Well, I couldn't do it as nonfiction or biography. I don't know the novel, with the form of the novel, you get to inhabit the characters, you get to become them. And so I could become my grandmother, and then in that she could become a fictional character. And she was so busy her whole life becoming a legend, turning herself into a myth, that she was pure fiction. In fact, I didn't bother to change her name because she was, or her multiple names, because she was a fictional character in a way. Like that's what she was busy doing. But it's not a memoir, because then I would have just stayed in the first person. But the form of the novel allows you to go deep inside of character and to inhabit them.
What
So
skills do you think you needed to acquire in order to tackle such a big narrative?
I had to understand how you can both move fast with exposition and then slow down with scene, and in order to be able to cover so much time. That was one of the technical issues. And then I had to understand what she was trying to tell me by telling these stories, and my sisters too. But why was she constantly telling us these stories? And when you're younger, they're more they're more one-dimensional. These are just the stories. But as you get older, it's a legacy. Even if it isn't all true, or there's only a little tiny kernel of truth in some of the stuff, it's that, oral tradition. She's passing something along to be passed along, to be passed along again. And it's come from here, and it's going there. And we're just here for this instant to pass it along. And stories can work like that, and certainly life does. And I couldn't see that as a young person.
I do have to congratulate you, because I think you really deftly moved between time periods. So it wasn't like, okay, here we are in another place, like it's not like film where you can say on the bottom 1912, Vladivostok, but you really were able to encompass all these histories and connect them. So I wasn't confused. I thought that was really, really a remarkable thing to do.
Thank you.
You talk also a lot about things that are very relevant to us right in this moment, in this pandemic. There's the flu that goes through Butte, Montana. There's racial elements. The character of Glenna, who's Grammy's mother, winds up teaching an Indian reservation. It really is a lot of the history of America through character. And in that way, I think it's very, very accessible and very, very believable.
Well, that was one of the things that I wanted to do. I wanted to look at, we are living through big history right now. I mean, I thought it was pretty big a couple of years ago, pretty awful and pretty big. And I mean, it's just exploded. Right. This is a real moment for all of us to be keeping journals and bearing witness and writing things down, because it will mean something to people downstream, whether we're writers or not. But those of us who are writers, we really have an obligation to be paying attention and writing stuff down. But we're also living our ordinary lives, where I'm dealing with my mom who's got dementia. I've moved my family to New Jersey to keep my son from, getting COVID from going to see a friend because he's 16. And I'm peddling my novel, and I am teaching, and I'm being a wife and a mom, and, I'm planting a garden. So we do all these things, yet there's also this just horrendous tragedy, and these, just finally the dam is broke with the phenomenal protests, and it really seems like we're on the precipice of significant change for the first time in my lifetime, or my conscious lifetime. So we are in this, we are against this huge backdrop right now, as they were with wars and pandemics of the flu of 1918. And so I was interested in that juxtaposition, but primarily of of not some big historic character, but just a woman, not just a woman, but a woman.
I also think, the whole theme of invention and self-invention. You know, we have a character who is occupying the White House right now, who is the master of invention and lies, you know, and it's sort of like an American tradition. And you see that in the history of America. Do you know what I mean? Like some of the great heroes and the mythologies that are created from their lives once they stopped living, you know, is not who they were in real life. And that is so much a part of the American ideal, you know, is this, you get to the next stage, you make some money, you have a family, you buy a house, you recreate yourself in some ways. And I thought that the novel was so wonderful in exploring that, you know, in showing, because, and then also like she didn't have white privilege, you Grammy. She was literally what they would call white trash, you know. She had to completely and totally create you know, a soul for herself. And I felt it was like, when I was reading the book, I felt in the beginning it was like Willa Cather, and then there was a little bit of Edith Wharton, and then there was a little bit of John Cheever. That's what I felt
all
like.
favorites. Thank you.
that you were able, and these are all, you know, elements of America. And it's such a wonderful book to read right now, especially with such a strong female protagonist, and going through really hard-scrabbled childhood, and then trying to give what she's learned. She's a hard ass, you know what I mean? She's a survivor, but she's also tender in some ways. But that's not what got her to survive, or anyone around her. I want to talk a little bit about the character of Jenna, her mother, who was a suffragette. Is that an invented character, or was that based on her real mother?
It was based on her real mother, and that's her real name. And she's on the wall over there. I'm in the room of ancestors. When I moved down here,
That's great.
I moved into my grandmother's room, which was pretty much left as it had been when she died. So with all the ancestors on the wall, and Glenna's over there. But again, she was as much a fictional character for me as my grandma, even more so because I didn't know her. But I heard these, you know, I heard some stories, and I took, they're like little seeds, you know, you put it in my imagination and it grows. So I had heard that she was a musician. I heard that she was an itinerant school teacher, that she was intrepid. There were stories about being on the reservation, and I took those and I grew them so that I could inhabit them.
She's a fabulous character. I mean, and it's also a real sense of what it was like to live out there without anything. I mean, they had to be doctors, they had to be carpenters, they had to be hunters. You know, they had to constantly really create the lives around them. They didn't have anything. And she comes and she goes. And in the very beginning, I mean, there's this, I hope people will read the book. She sort of takes $100 out of her husband's wallet, I think. I don't know where she had the $100.
Sort of collect,
and she gets on the train, and then she like leaves the two little girls in the company of all these nuns and disappears. And then there's this big snowfall, and then the kids don't know if the mother's ever going to come back. The kids are stealing the food from the nuns. And meanwhile, she's in the dining car playing the violin and doing what she does, which is sort of getting money, getting attention, figuring out her next step in her life as a lone woman going out west. So she's a really original character. They're all really original characters.
Oh, thank you. She's maneuvering to figure it all out. And I think her daughter learned a bit from her.
But they, you know, when you think about that, that was how they got ahead. You know what I mean? This kind of, they didn't have the opportunities. And so you sort of respect them, even in their contrariness or their difficultness or maybe their lack of emotion. But it was how they survived. I mean, that was how they got ahead in the world.
Yeah.
And so how do you see, you know, being a white woman, you know, you mentioned it before, as a writer of a great skill and talent, how do you use your abilities to move this progressive movement forward? I mean, what place do you see for your books? You know, I think it's a difficult moment, you know, because we're all pushing books by women of color, men of color, trans women, LGBTQ women. But, you know, your book has such an important place as well. And it tells the story not just of your story, but it is the story of America, which is this melting pot. And I think you can't really forget that,
Right.
as a writer. But then you also have this responsibility to move people forward,
Right. You
take
do.
people along with you.
Yeah. I mean, that's going to be up to readers to figure out whether this is a book they want to read now. I'm so thrilled because I'm in a third printing, which is
That's amazing.
a first for me. And I've been, at the beginning of the pandemic, I thought, and we had a conversation, should we postpone? They decided not to. And somewhere along the way, I became quite bold, and I asked for help, and I just didn't mind doing the promotional stuff, which I had never done before. And it's not easy for me to ask people for help, but I did. And people were so willing. And I've just had great, from near and far. And then right around the publication day, the protest started, and that put a whole new element on it. And it was the book launch on June 2. There was dialogue about whether we should cancel or not, postpone really. And then it was decided not, and we went forward, and it was wonderful. And in all of that, I realized I can hold two things at the same time. I can talk about this and think about what I can do better. For me, I want to read a lot. I can certainly, there are many voices that I want to know that I have yet to discover. But I also want to act. And I think, I read somewhere that, white people just want to join a book crew. And, one of the things, that we really need to figure out is also how to act. And, I am a writer. I don't know the answer to that exactly right now, but I do know that the novel's power is to provide perspective, and it's also to acknowledge complexity, and to practice empathy. And I want to write another novel, and I am who I am. But
we all have to own who we are.
Yeah.
And and I think this novel is such a great novel to read now, because we're all kind of stuck at home. We're probably all watching too much Netflix. Like my husband likes Norwegian death mysteries, where they decompose the bodies. That's what my husband likes. But this is such a transporting narrative. And, and it's one where you get really carried away, but you also learn so much. And it's so beautifully written. It's just really a great book. And I think it can be translated to our times in so many ways. It's like you go back in time, and how did they deal with the flu epidemic? The flu epidemic destroyed towns, destroyed livelihoods.
Montana was very hard hit, like the worst hit in the nation, I believe that it was.
And it was, after being so promising, completely destroyed. And, we are now in a time of self-invention as well.
Yeah.
We don't know how we're going to come out of this, how our lives are going to be, what's going to be the new normal. Right. And I think we can learn a lot by going back in the past and seeing how people coped with their personal, challenges. But also we need to uncover that was what was buried. This is Juneteenth, right?
Yes.
This right? So we have to really explore, what does that mean? What was the history that we learned as opposed to the history that was hidden from us? Right. And I think that that's a lot of our responsibility as thinkers and writers, to really investigate that in order to move forward, in order to challenge, the history that has been given to us.
I think that is one of the keys: challenge the history that was given to us.
And so what did you have to do for this book that you wouldn't have done before because of the pandemic?
Well, partly I had to ask for help, because it was, it was clear to me that all the bookstores shut, the events shutting down, things closing up. But there is the internet, and so I thought of that. So just on a personal level, I had to become more bold and more assertive and fight for my book. And it was gratifying. It's been very gratifying. I love this book, and I like to talk about it. And I love the help. I'm so grateful for all the help I've been given. So that was a big thing. And then just to morph, I look at our English department. I teach at Hofstra, and the arts are just slowly dwindling in academia. And I talk a lot about, creative thinking and the need to to figure it out. I say all the time, we're writers and readers. We have the creative thinking skills to turn this around.
Right.
And I've had to employ that with right now. And I think we all do. And we've all had to figure out how to reimagine our lives, whether we're still in our small apartments or we are in New Jersey taking care of a mother with dementia. Or, everybody's challenge is different, and many are much graver than mine, but it is a moment of reinvention, as you say. It has that potential.
How have you recreated your writing and teaching spaces?
Well, you mean physically in New Jersey?
Yeah, because I think that people don't really ever talk about it, but writers are writers almost like baseball players. I think that you need to have the security of the space around you.
You're right.
You've worked so hard to create it, then you have to uplift yourself during a pandemic, go to your mother's house, and recreate your space. So right. How have you done that?
Well, the first thing I did was put a table right there in front of me are sliding glass doors that look out on a little a forest. Actually, it's a pre-revolutionary forest, which is really cool. And I learned that a year ago. I grew up here with trees that are like monster trees that are over 400 years old. But there was this little weedy patch, and I raked it out. It was filled with leaves and grossness, and I planted a little white lilac tree and made it very pretty. So that it's like all overgrown and riotous, but I made it as pretty as I could, and I put my little my journal and I just set it up so that I had my space. It's in the place I sleep, but that's fine.
Yeah.
It's a quiet room, and I like to get up early and do my work. And if my husband's asleep, that's fine. I can just sit here and do that. Or I go out and, read, but I had to have the desk. I had to have the desk.
Yeah, well, it looks fantastic. And then you have all of your ancestors looking over you.
I had to get rid of
giving you their blessing, let's hope, not condemning you.
Yeah.
What was I going to say? So are you working on something now, or are you just really, did it come out of this? It's something completely, your novels
it actually, yeah, I have 3 things. One is a memoir that is going to be on pause. And I've never done that before, but I really got into this in a moment when I couldn't, when I was stuck with an elegant woman, and it was just a really terrible time. And I had a conversation with my dad, and he said to me, I was struggling with writing, and he said, just write shit, fuck, just write that all over the pages, and then see what happens. And I started doing that, and then I started thinking about every memory I ever had of being with him, and I started writing this down. And 100 pages or 150 pages later, I was, still going, and it was really moving to me. But it's something that I'll do, but it's not something. It's on pause. I also started another novel when I was struggling with an elegant woman a while ago. That I won't tell you the plot, but it actually has something to do with right now that I didn't understand, and I really want to go back to that. But I also have a draft, a complete draft of a novel called Scheherazade, which is the love story between Winter and Arthur. and that's which are characters in
Wow.
this novel.
Wow.
She's Grammy's daughter, and she's a white woman of privilege who falls in love with her fiance's and then husband's best friend, who's a Jamaican basketball player, and they have this lifelong love story. And that's the one that I've written a draft of. And the premise is really quite simple. Um, it's a very short, intimate novel, but it's a daughter telling her mother, who has dementia, this her long love story.
Now, was that a part of this novel that just didn't fit in the novel that you then took aside, or was it something that you thought about after the novel was published?
A little bit of both. Like the concept of the daughter telling the mother, who can't remember her love story, came later. But there were, this was a larger novel that I slimmed down and concentrated on the grandmother character.
Yeah.
And so there were some chapters removed
Right.
that I always loved, and
Right.
they found their way into this book.
Yeah,
So, and it's something it's also, I want to explore, I want to be thinking about, white privilege, and it's a theme here within their love affair. So,
and that was, I love that part of the book. And I thought that, Winter basically is young woman engaged to a brilliant person. He's a novelist. He has a breakdown. She goes over and to take care of him, and the person picking her up from the airport or the train, I can't remember, is Arthur, who then she falls madly in love with and realizes that that's really the love of her life. But she marries I can't remember his name right now, but then she marries the novelist, Timothy. That's right.
I forgot for a second.
But it was thank you. We all need that, There's just so much information you can put in your brain. But it was also a beautiful story. And also, I'm probably one of the few people who remember who Zazu Pitts is. She has a daughter named Zazu.
Yeah.
She was a character on some television show in the 50s or 60s. She played a manicurist. But she was famous for being a silent film star.
Yes.
Yeah, so
that's
I love
where
that.
I saw her. Yeah.
And I thought, and I love all the names of your characters and of the sisters. That they're kind of old-fashioned names, but very modern girls. So let's see, what time is it? Do we have any questions from anybody?
Yeah, I have a question. You said it took 8 years to write An Elegant Woman?
Yes.
I'm curious how different that first complete draft, or your first complete draft, was from the book that people will get in the mail. Were there customers, or were there characters that originally played a bigger part that you had to take out? What was the sort of editing process like?
So yeah, it was originally, the structure was, there were 10 chapters, one for each decade, but it was relatively the same. There are more chapters now, but the scope of the time frame is the same. In the original draft that I finished, I gave to my husband. He loved it. He said, "It's the best thing you've ever written," and I was so excited and happy. And it had many challenges after that, and I needed to slim it down. And I realized that there was a lot going on, so I did take out. I took out the Winter Arthur story, but it wasn't complete, and it wasn't the right place for it. So I removed it. So I mean, there are little bits of it, it's still there, but it's not there in the way that I want to give it in this other book. And then the structure became different. I always knew I wanted a first person. I always had the first person narrator, but I didn't understand how I was using her until very, very late. In fact, I knew I was doing it. I knew sometimes it was working and it was good, but I didn't maybe have the confidence yet to understand how to employ it you know, with the confidence, I guess, with the energy it needed. And a friend gave me Carol Shields' The Stone Diaries to read. I read it, and 2 months later, the book was finished. And I owned that first person narrator. She begins the novel, and she's the through line, and all of the stories hang on her, basically. So she's inhabiting, even though it's third person, she's the person that's taken us in there. And that was late in coming and not in the earlier version. And it makes the book a lot better. In fact, I think that, that first draft was was interesting. It was more ambitious in a like experimental way. But yeah, it took a long time to get to that.
And
one of the things I want to say, for people who don't know, and Martha's career is very independent. Her father, who she asked for advice, is the great writer John McPhee. So, who's written books about writing. So, when somebody like that tells you, "Oh, just write whatever you want," so that really.
Oh, he listened a lot. I think he was a little worried about me at one point because I really had to reimagine the book,
Right.
Talk about reinvention. I did have to, because that structure was like, a house of cards, and you took one thing away, the whole thing fell down.
Right.
So I had to really rethink how I was going to approach this. And from that point to it being finished was 3 years. So it was a long journey. And I'm so glad it's over.
But you did a great job. Last thing I want to ask is, can you show us that? I love the image on the cover of the book. Can you tell us anything about that?
You want me to show you? I mean, I think does it appear?
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
Right side up, yes.
It looks like an Escher painting in a way, but
yeah, I just love it. They actually came up with a different cover first of a woman looking in a mirror, her profile, and I loved that. It was so pretty. But then a few weeks later, they came with this, and I was just blown away.
Mm.
And to me, it's that continuum, the reflection in the mirror. It just speaks to what the novel is speaking about in the most direct, obvious way, but it's so artfully and beautifully. And it reminds me of, like a surrealist and Edward Hopper together,
No, it's fabulous. I mean, John and I, we're both booksellers. That's another part of my life. And, covers really mean a lot. They say you can't judge a book by a cover, but a cover can draw you in. And a cover that really tells you something about what the book is about, as well as being very, very seductive, is a great thing. So they did a great job.
Yeah, I think so. It's the greatest cover I've ever had.
I have just one more question. You're not home in New York City, Martha, right?
No, I left in March because I have a 16-year-old and I had no idea how I would contain him.
But you said that you would go outside to read, and I'm always curious what people are reading, but especially if they are not reading from their own personal library. I mean, you're in a place where the books.
Goodness, I wish I could show you though. So there weren't enough rooms for my
Right.
for my son. So for the first month, he was just sleeping here and there because he finally said to me, "I need a room." And so I went into my stepfather died in 1994. This house is like deferred maintenance. Nothing has been done here until I came in March. And I took every book off the shelf. If you imagine all those books behind you in a square room, just floor to ceiling, it looks like a bookstore in there. Mm-hmm. And it is the biggest personal library I've ever seen. They're my stepfather's books. There's poetry, there's art, there's philosophy, there's feminism, there's war and peace, and there aren't that many novels, but there's a vast collection. And early on I realized I could spend the rest of my life in this room and not read
That's fantastic. That's a good place to land.
Yeah. So, and I cleaned each book They were
Oh, wow.
so dusty. 20 years of dust.
Wow.
Well, thank you so much for letting us host you, and congratulations on the publication of An Elegant Woman. The link to buy it is there in the chat. And thank you, Cheryl, of course, for continuing your series with us. There are a couple more coming in. Actually, there's one more in June, and then we have.
Yeah, there's with Helen Epstein, who published her mother's memoir about the war called Francie's War.
Yeah. So there's a lot of good stuff coming. You can go to McNallyJackson.com and look at our events calendar and take a look. But Cheryl, Martha, and everybody who joined us tonight, thank you so much. Have a beautiful Friday night here in New York. It's nice out there. Just be well and be safe, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you, Martha.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. Okay.
Good night.
Okay, I'll see you soon.
Bye.